세 번째 발표를 부탁드리겠습니다. 브라드포드 대학에서 오신 크리스토퍼 블러스 교수님 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this conference, and I'm going to break from the tradition in this panel and use PowerPoint. I hope to get across some of the ideas in what turned out to be an extremely long and complex paper, which hopefully will be available at some point. So I'm just going to outline a few of the issues that sort of inform the North Korean nuclear program, and I want to look at the consequences of the strategy of dealing with the nuclear program and what risks lie ahead in the future. So the first point is that we should look at the question, what is the security issue as it's viewed from the North Korean perspective. Now, the first problem that North Korea faces is that it is suffering from strategic isolation. While this strategic isolation is self-imposed, it also constrains a lot of things that North Korea can actually do and contributes to the problems of survival of the North Korean state. And it faces a threat from the United States. It remains unclear to the extent which North Koreans actually believe that there is a military threat from the United States. The more fundamental threat from the United States for North Korea is not military but political. The fact that the United States does not accept the fundamental legitimacy of the North Korean regime. North Korea faces the potential threat of socio-economic collapse because the North Korean state is in many respects not viable. In order to make the country economically viable, it would have to reform very fundamentally. However, the regime believes that if it does reform, it will lose control over the country and therefore it will fall. So it's a kind of peculiar black hole that the North Korean regime has fallen into, that it cannot survive without reform and it cannot survive with reform. The problem of succession created enormous turmoil in the North Korean government, which still has not been fully resolved, even though at the moment Kim Jong-un seems to be firmly in charge. And then North Korea is facing the challenge that there is another Korea, there is South Korea, which for the North Korean population could form an example of what Korea could be. What is the threat at North Korea to the outside world? Well, first of all, that North Korea feels insecure in many respects is a threat to the outside world. And we can see the militaristic diplomacy that North Korea is engaged in as a sort of a spillover from the domestic insecurity that North Korea feels. And this results in the use of low-level military actions. We have the nuclear and missile threat. Again, primarily, I would consider this to be a political instrument rather than the threat of the actual use of nuclear weapons. We have the proliferation of unconventional weapons to other theaters in the world. And then we have the threat of collapse, which North Korea brandishes sometimes quite explicitly as a way of extorting support or supporting its diplomacy. And there's the threat felt in South Korea of North Korean propaganda and subversion. So assessing the risks, I think it's largely agreed that the strategic situation on the Korean Peninsula is stable in the sense that neither the United States nor the Republic of Korea believe that it's to the advantage to start a military conflict. And North Korea at the same time knows that if it does start a war, then this would be the end of the regime. But the intense militarization and the use of military threats as a part of North Korean diplomacy means that there is the possibility or the threat of unintended escalation. So the Korean Peninsula remains the one great area in Northeast Asia where a major war is still a live possibility. I'll briefly run through sort of the few slides about the data about nuclear weapons. Whether or not North Korea has in fact highly enriched uranium weapons is unknown. I think my colleagues in the field seem to be fairly confident that because there is an enrichment facility, that now North Korea has the capacity of producing highly enriched uranium weapons. That is unproven as to this point. And the latest test that North Korea conducted, many observers believe that it would be based on a uranium device, but this has not yet in fact been demonstrated, and the data were insufficient to prove it either way. And the plutonium stockpiles they have are still relatively limited, but that might obviously change as the Yongbyon facility has been restarted. North Korea claimed that that the latest test demonstrated warhead miniaturization. In order to be able to put nuclear warheads onto the missiles, they have to be reduced to a certain weight. The Nodong missile, for example, can carry a weight of 750 kilograms, which is on the low end of weight for a nuclear weapon. That, however, has not been proven, so we still are somewhat uncertain to what extent North Korea actually has deliverable nuclear weapons at this point in time. When we look at ballistic missiles, most of the missiles are based on the Soviet Scud technology. We have the Nodong, which is also based on Soviet missile technology from the 1950s, and which is a medium-range missile that could conceivably carry a nuclear warhead and target Japan and targets in South Korea. And then we have the whole question of the Taepodong series and the Unha related to the question whether or not North Korea can develop a intercontinental ballistic missile. The most successful launch was the most recent launch of the Unha 3, which was the first truly successful space launch. But nevertheless, the technical experts seem to be convinced that so far North Korea does not have a true ICBM capability that could deliver a warhead onto the continental United States. We have the Musudan, which is an intermediate range ballistic missile that many observers believe is based on a Soviet submarine-based missile. We don't actually know whether this missile exists for certain or not, because no tests have been conducted. And we also saw this so-called KN-08, which may be a new ICBM development, but we don't know whether this missile exists or what kind of engines it has. It is generally believed that the Unha is based on Nodong engines strapped together, and that raises sort of the interesting question what the source of these engines is. And some analysts believe that North Korea does not have the capacity to actually construct these engines itself, but is simply using engines it acquired from the former Soviet Union. And these are the kind of ranges that are estimated. These are pictures from the parade. So let me move on a little bit. So let me say simply this. At the moment, North Korea's missile and nuclear weapons capabilities are still relatively limited. That does not mean that this will always remain the case. In fact, the longer there are no constraints on North Korean capabilities, the more stockpiles of nuclear devices they will acquire, the closer they will come to actually having deliverable weapons, and they may eventually acquire an ICBM capability. What is the DPRK nuclear policy? Well, of course, first of all, it's about deterrence against an attack by the United States. At the same time, nuclear weapons seem to have an internal function of legitimation of the regime. It is the one way in which North Korea can actually demonstrate that it is a great and powerful country is by displaying the nuclear capability. It is used to support a strategy of military threats used in diplomacy. Its function is to guarantee the survival of the elite. And it was, at least in the past, it was also an incentive for the US to engage with North Korea. Whether that's still the case is open to question, perhaps. It creates enormous risks also for the DPRK because, first of all, it's unclear what the position of the United States would be if North Korea were to acquire the capacity to deliver warheads against the continental United States, and whether in sort of the run-up to such a capability, the United States might not adopt a very different and more aggressive posture towards North Korea. And as we've just heard, it also creates incentives for nuclear proliferation in the region. Now, the interesting question for me would not only be the response of Japan and South Korea, but how would North Korea feel about the prospects of Japan and South Korea acquiring nuclear weapons? And a South Korean nuclear weapon might be even more dangerous for North Korea than an American nuclear weapon. It also may provoke sanctions and further isolation, and also impact negatively on relations with China. Now, how do we look at North Korea's foreign policy? And I think what's interesting is that it actually can be quite hard looking at the policies of various US administrations and even policies conducted by the policies towards North Korea by South Korea to understand how do they conceptualize the North Korean regime and explain why North Koreans are doing what they're doing. And so I've labeled, first of all, the conservative paradigm, which links North Korean foreign policy to authoritarianism and basically says, well, this is in the nature of the regime. They behave like this towards their own population, and they are so aggressive in their foreign policy. The liberal paradigm basically sees North Korea's aggressiveness as a response to the external threat, and the policy recommendation from that would be that if the threat is being mitigated, then North Korean foreign policy behavior might change. However, after 10 years of particular forms of engagement with North Korea, there's no evidence that this is actually the case. And then some people try to discern the existence of hardliners and engagers in North Korea. And this raises the question, if you find the right people to engage with in North Korea, you might have more success. The policy options in the end with regard to North Korea amount to either promoting a regime change, but the attempt to use military force or pressure against North Korea to effect regime change is too dangerous, and moreover, regime change itself might provoke a quite dangerous collapse in North Korea that would be uncontainable. Or the idea of simply containing North Korea, but the problem is, if we contain North Korea and just then do not deal with North Korea, that doesn't help, because North Korea simply won't leave us alone. So the really only option is to engage with North Korea, but I think what the efforts to engage with North Korea have taught us is that while that can mitigate tensions and can mitigate threats, our expectations should be relatively low. I'm going to skip a little bit over this part because I want to get to the main point over of the paper, which is that a new way of looking at relations between North and South Korea is to look at it as a persistent conflict. And there are models that look at how persistent conflicts evolve over time. And so we look at the possibility of an initial onset, initial shock like the Korean War that created a permanent conflict with then period of stasis where you get regular and consistent hostile interactions fluctuating around what is called the basic rivalry level. Then crises followed by de-escalation and more crisis. And this is one of the interesting points, is to see that we do get this peculiar spiral of crisis with great hostility from North Korea and then efforts by North Korea to engage with South Korea or the United States. Among the possible causes of protracted conflicts are most commonly territorial disputes, like in South Asia, for example, or cultural and religious factors, ideological factors that question the legitimacy of one of the parties, in this case the DPRK versus the ROK as the representatives of the true Korea, and persistent threats to the survival of one of the parties. Now, the interesting question here is, what is the impact of nuclear weapons on protracted conflicts? And one of the key beliefs in international relations is that nuclear weapons prevent wars. Now, in the case of a persistent conflict, what that means is it also prevents the resolution of the conflict, because neither side has the capacity to resolve the conflict on its own terms. So what that means is the conflict remains frozen and it cannot proceed to its natural cycle of escalation, de-escalation and resolution. And then we see that the side that is most dissatisfied with the status quo will engage in various forms of provocation and provoking crises in order to advance its position. We also have this concept of the stability-instability paradox, which states that stability at the strategic level gives rise to instability at the convention level if there is an imbalance of forces. In other words, because nobody can afford to go to war, one side feels it can afford to engage in these military provocations because it doesn't fear the punishment of a nuclear attack or even a major conventional attack. And this model has been widely used in relations to India and Pakistan, for example. I'm saying it's not applicable to Korea because North Korea is inferior both in conventional and nuclear weapons to the United States and the Republic of Korea. But what we see here is an asymmetric risk behavior by the dissatisfied party that fits into persistent conflict theory. In other words, South Korea has a lot more to lose if there's a major outbreak of conflict. And therefore, North Korea can feel that it has the confidence to use at least low-level confrontations in order to pursue its agenda. So how does it end? Well, conflict transformation theory states that a frozen nuclear conflict requires a major endogenous shock. And I list various scenarios. I don't necessarily claim that these scenarios are likely. I'm just seeing this as possible ways in which this might end. And one of them would be if China abandons support for North Korea. Another one would be if there's internal collapse in North Korea. Of course, the most perhaps desirable development would be if North Korea were to reform and open up to the world. Or if the United States pursues a more aggressive policy in response to a North Korean ICBM. Since neither of these scenarios are very likely to occur in the near future, I would say this conflict is going to persist for a considerable period of time yet to come. Now, I think we should think about the possibility that arms control can be used as a mitigating factor, because if we don't try to limit future developments of North Koreans' nuclear capabilities, that might bring about such issues. Trajectory of North Korean nuclear development is increased stockpile in nuclear material and devices, miniaturization of warheads for delivery by missiles, development of longer-range missiles or ICBMs. What the policy of strategic patience of the Obama administration means is that these developments are not challenged. Can arms control succeed? Well, I would say we have to start from the recognition that denuclearization is extremely likely. So if we persist with the point of view that we will not engage with North Korea on the nuclear issue unless they're willing to disarm, then we are hiding to nowhere. Nuclear weapons, of course, are not to be used, but only for deterrence and domestic legitimation. So North Korean nuclear policy could be compatible with some arms control preventing future expansion of capabilities. So I'm suggesting that future engagement with North Korea is essential to mitigate crisis and conflict overall. Thank you.